The summer of 1995 found me patrolling Olympic National Park in Washington State. My name's Eli Blackbird, and at 28 years old, I thought I had seen just about everything these woods could throw at a person. I grew up on the Makah Reservation, where the rainforest meets the Pacific. The damp moss, the ocean chill, the towering cedars, they were as familiar to me as my own heartbeat. Most days, the park was peaceful. Hikers stuck to their marked trails, kayakers paddled carefully through the Strait of Juan de Fuca, and the occasional grumpy bear startled out of its berry patch was the most excitement we'd see. Easy work, for the most part. But there's an old saying among the Makah: the forest gives, and the forest takes. That summer, I learned just how much the forest could take. I remember the day it all started to change. It was early June, the kind of morning where the mist clings to the treetops, refusing to burn off even as the sun climbs higher. I was doing my usual rounds, checking on campsites and making sure no one had wandered off where they shouldn't. The air was heavy with the scent of pine and damp earth, and somewhere in the distance I could hear the mournful cry of a loon. That's when I found the first sign that something was wrong. At first, I thought it was just another animal carcass, sad, but part of the natural cycle. But as I got closer, my stomach turned. This wasn't the clean kill of a predator looking for food. The deer had been torn apart, its insides strewn across the forest floor in a way that spoke of mindless violence. No animal I knew hunted like this. I radioed it in, of course. The higher-ups chalked it up to a particularly aggressive bear, maybe one that had developed a taste for human food and lost its fear of people. But even as I nodded along to their explanations, a chill ran down my spine. My grandmother's stories echoed in my mind, tales of old spirits and creatures that lurked in the deepest parts of the forest, things that were best left undisturbed. Over the next few weeks, more reports came in. Hikers finding mutilated animals, campers swearing they heard unnatural noises in the night. The tension in the park was palpable. Rangers started going out in pairs, and even the most experienced outdoorsmen were keeping closer to the main trails. Then came the day we found the first body, July 4th, 1995. While most of America was celebrating with barbecues and fireworks, I was trudging through a remote part of the park, following up on a report of an overdue hiker. James Holbrook, 42, from Seattle. Experienced outdoorsman, they said. Knew the park like the back of his hand. The rain had started up again, a fine drizzle that soaked through my jacket and made the forest floor treacherous. Every step squelched, the mud trying to pull my boots off. I remember thinking how easy it would be to twist an ankle out here, to end up stranded miles from help. I found Holbrook's campsite just as the light was starting to fade. The tent was in tatters, shredded fabric flapping weakly in the damp breeze. His belongings were scattered in a wide arc, as if something had exploded outward from the center of the camp. And the smell. God, the smell. Like rotten meat and something else. Something I couldn't quite place, but that made my skin crawl. I radioed it in, my voice shaking more than I'd like to admit. Possible 187 at Holbrook's last known location, requesting backup and forensics team. Even as I said it, part of me hoped I was wrong. That maybe Holbrook had just run into some bad luck with his gear and was holed up somewhere, waiting for rescue. But then I saw the drag marks leading away from the camp, dark stains on the undergrowth that I knew with a sickening certainty was blood. Against every instinct screaming at me to turn back, I followed the trail. I found what was left of James Holbrook about a quarter mile from his camp. I won't describe the details. Some things, once seen, can't be unseen. But I will say this. No bear, no mountain lion, no animal I've ever encountered could have done that kind of damage to a human body. The official report chalked it up to a rogue bear, maybe the same one responsible for the animal mutilations. But everyone who saw that scene knew the truth. Bears don't do that kind of damage. Bears don't leave claw marks that look more like they came from hands than paws. And bears certainly don't arrange a man's internal organs in patterns that look disturbingly deliberate. That night, as I lay in my bunk at the ranger station, unable to sleep, I couldn't shake the feeling that we had crossed some invisible line, that by finding Holbrook's body, we had acknowledged the presence of something that had no place in our world. And now that we had seen it had seen us too. The summer stretched on, and with it came more disappearances. A fisherman vanished from his favorite spot on the coast, leaving behind nothing but a pool of blood staining the rocks. They said it was a freak wave, the kind the Pacific's known for snatching folks. But I've seen what the ocean can do, and this wasn't it. Tourists started canceling their reservations. The locals grew quiet and watchful, and through it all, the forest seemed to grow darker, more oppressive, like it was holding its breath, waiting for something to break. August 15th, 1995, the day that changed everything. I got a call from dispatch about a pair of hikers who had gone off trail and failed to check in. Standard procedure in those days was to send out a single ranger for initial recon. Looking back, I wonder if things might have gone differently if we had been going out in teams by then. The forest was eerily quiet that day. No bird song, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush. Just the steady drip of rain from the branches and the sound of my own breathing. The air felt heavy, charged with something I couldn't quite name. I found their campsite easily enough. It was the same scene I'd come across too many times that summer. Tent ripped open, gear scattered, the ground stained dark with what I knew was blood. But this time something was different. The destruction seemed fresher, like whatever had done this might still be nearby. That's when I heard it. A low rumbling growl from deeper in the trees. It wasn't a sound any animal native to these woods should make. It was deeper, more guttural, and carried with it a note of intelligence that sent ice through my veins. I drew my gun, though some part of me knew it would be useless. My grandmother's stories came flooding back, tales of the Wendigo, of Sasquatch, of things that walked the line between our world and the spirit realm. I had always taken them as lessons, warnings wrapped in myth. Now I wasn't so sure. The trees parted and it stepped into view. God help me, I still don't have the words to fully describe what I saw. It was tall, easily twice the height of a man, with a body that seemed to shift between solid muscle and insubstantial shadow. Its skin was a mottled brown and black, perfectly camouflaged for the deep forest. But its eyes, those I'll never forget. They burned yellow in the dim light, filled with a hunger that went beyond mere predatory instinct. When it opened its mouth to roar, I saw row upon row of teeth, far too many for any natural creature. The stench that rolled off it was like rotting meat and something older, mustier, like opened graves and forgotten places. I'd like to say I stood my ground, that I faced this impossible thing with courage. But the truth is, terror took hold. I fired my gun, more out of reflex than any real hope it would do damage. The bullet seemed to sink into its flesh without effect, like throwing pebbles at a boulder. It charged, moving faster than anything that size had any right to. I turned and ran. The forest blurred around me as I sprinted through the underbrush. Branches whipped at my face. Roots seemed to reach up to tangle my feet. Behind me, I could hear the creature crashing through the trees, its roars echoing off the mountains. I don't know how long I ran. Time seemed to stretch and warp, minutes feeling like hours. My lungs burned, each breath a ragged gasp. But worse than the physical exhaustion was the knowledge that this thing, whatever it was, wasn't just trying to kill me. It was savoring the hunt. Up ahead, I saw a break in the trees. As I burst out of the forest, I realized with a sickening lurch that I had run straight to the edge of a cliff. Below, a river churned through a rocky gorge, white water crashing over boulders. For a split second, I hesitated. The fall could kill me just as surely as the thing behind me. But then I heard another roar, closer now, and made my choice. I ran full tilt towards the edge and jumped. The air whistled past my ears as I fell. Time seemed to slow. I saw the creature reach the cliff's edge, its roar one of frustrated rage. Then the water rushed up to meet me and everything went dark. I don't remember much of what happened next. Flashes of consciousness, the icy shock of the water, the tumbling current threatening to dash me against rocks, my lungs screaming for air. By some miracle, my flailing hand caught a submerged tree root near the bank. I clung to it with every ounce of strength I had left, pulling myself onto a muddy outcropping. I lay there coughing and shivering for what felt like hours. The roar of the river filled my ears, punctuated by the pounding of my own heart. When I finally found the strength to move, to climb out of the gorge and make my way back to civilization, the sun was setting. I stumbled into the ranger station, looking like something death had spit back out, bleeding, bruised, and probably half drowned. They rushed me to the hospital in Port Angeles, murmuring about exhaustion and shock. No one believed my story about the creature. Why would they? It sounded insane even to my own ears. I was officially listed as the only survivor of whatever had attacked the missing hikers. My miraculous escape was chalked up to blind luck and my familiarity with the terrain. In the quiet of the hospital room, as painkillers blurred the edges of the world, I started to doubt myself. Had I really seen what I thought I saw? Or had the stress of the summer, the gruesome discoveries, and the growing fear finally broken something in my mind? Part of me hoped that was the case, because the alternative, that something so impossible, so filled with mindless hunger, could be stalking the woods I called home, was far more terrifying than any psychological break. I spent weeks recovering. My broken ribs mended, the cuts and bruises faded to yellow-green smudges, but the nightmares lingered. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, the creature's roar ringing in my ears, and the stench of rot clinging to the air. Even in the sterile safety of the hospital, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, hunted. When I finally got the all clear to return to duty, it was with a knot of dread tightening in my gut. The Park Service wanted me on desk duty, said I needed more time. But I knew I couldn't hide behind a stack of paperwork while that thing was still out there. I insisted on returning to patrols, ignoring the concerned looks from my fellow rangers. The forest was different now. Each creaking branch and rustle of leaves made me jumpy. Shadows seemed to shift and morph in the corners of my vision, taking on that monstrous form that haunted my dreams. At first I saw it everywhere, lurking at the edge of clearings, disappearing just as I turned my head. But as weeks of tense vigilance passed without incident, I began to wonder if my mind was playing tricks on me. The other rangers, my friends and colleagues, treated me differently too. They'd pat my shoulder, make vague reassurances, and share furtive glances when they thought I wasn't looking. It didn't matter that before the attack, I had been one of the most reliable members of the team. Now, I was that crazy ranger who saw monsters in the woods. But I wasn't going to give up. Even if no one else believed, I knew what I had seen, and I was determined to find answers. In the months that followed, I threw myself into research. My off hours were spent poring over old park records, digging into local legends, and reaching out to elders on the reservation. I was looking for any scrap of information that might shed light on what I had encountered. Deep within the dusty archives of the Park Service, hidden away like the creature itself, I found the first threads of a pattern. Stretching back centuries, there were reports of disappearances, animal mutilations, and sightings of something that could only be described as monstrous. The details varied, but the core remained the same, a presence in the forest that defied natural law, that seemed to feed on fear and chaos as much as flesh. And there, whispered in the oldest Makah legends, I found a name, the Hohawk. The stories described it as a dark spirit, a twisting of the natural order that craved violence for its own sake. It wasn't just a predator, it was a corrupter, warping the forest itself to its terrible purposes. I became obsessed. I read everything I could find about Hohawk lore, about similar creatures in other traditions. Some accounts spoke of ways to drive it back, to disrupt its influence on the world. But the rituals they described were dangerous, often demanding sacrifices I wasn't sure I was willing to make. Yet every time another missing persons report landed on my desk, every time I returned to those blood-stained campsites, my resolve hardened. This thing, this Hohawk, had to be stopped, no matter the cost. It was nearing the end of autumn when I made my decision. The tourist season was winding down, the forest preparing for its winter slumber. If there was ever a time to confront the Hohawk, it would be now, when its power might be at its weakest. One night, after my shift ended, I slipped away from the ranger station. My backpack was heavy with supplies, herbs gathered based on the old rituals, salt, a rusted hunting knife that had belonged to my great-grandfather. I traveled by the light of a waning moon, deeper into the wilderness than any ranger was meant to go. My destination was a clearing I had found in the oldest part of the park. Something about the place had an unsettling stillness, the air heavy with an expectant energy. If the Hohawk had a lair, a place where its influence was strongest, this had to be it. As I stepped into the clearing, the forest around me seemed to hold its breath. The usual nighttime sounds, the hoot of owls, the rustle of small creatures, fell silent. I began the ritual, my voice wavering as I spoke the old Maka words. I scattered the herbs in a wide circle, creating a barrier of salt. My fear was a palpable thing, a constant buzz beneath my skin, but with it came a kind of desperate determination. I had come too far to turn back now. As I chanted, the air grew colder. The rustling of the trees became more insistent, as if the forest itself was trying to warn me away. And then I felt it, the weight of an ancient, malevolent presence settling over the clearing. It was watching, waiting. The Hohawk stepped out of the darkness, every bit as monstrous as I remembered. Its yellow eyes narrowed in fury as it stalked towards the edge of my salt circle. Rancid drool dripped from its mouth, sizzling where it hit the ground. I held my ground, my voice trembling as I reached the final phase of the ritual. With a deep breath, I raised the old hunting knife and sliced a long cut across my palm. My blood dripped onto the forest floor, and the clearing thrummed with unnatural energy. I cried out the final words of the ritual, my voice rising to a shout that echoed through the trees. There was a blinding flash of light and a howl of rage that seemed to split the night itself. The air crackled with power as the Hohawk shuddered, its form flickering and distorting like a bad TV signal. The creature lunged forward, clawing at the edge of the salt circle. I could feel the barrier weakening, the ancient magic struggling against the Hohawk's raw power. For a moment, I thought I had failed, that the ritual wasn't strong enough. But then, with a final eardrum-shattering screech, the Hohawk began to dissolve. Not into smoke or mist, but into the very fabric of the forest itself. It was as if the trees, the earth, the very air were reclaiming the twisted spirit, undoing the corruption that had allowed it to take physical form. In the span of a heartbeat, it was gone. The clearing fell silent, the unnatural energy dissipating like morning mist. I stood there, blood dripping from my wounded hand, scarcely able to believe what had just happened. As the first rays of dawn began to filter through the trees, I made my way back to the ranger station. Exhaustion crashed over me in waves, but beneath it was a sense of, not peace exactly, but something earned, something accomplished. In the days and weeks that followed, the change in the park was palpable. The attacks stopped. Hikers and wildlife were safe once more. It was as if a dark cloud had lifted, allowing the natural rhythm of the forest to reassert itself. I never told anyone the full story of what happened that night. Who would believe me? Instead, I bandaged my hand, cited a clumsy accident with my hunting knife, and went about my duties as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed. I saw the world differently now, the edges blurred between what was solid and real, and what might lurk just out of sight. The Hohawk was gone, banished by old magic and a sacrifice of blood. But I knew now that the stories, the things people dismissed as myths and campfire tales, sometimes held more truth than we were comfortable admitting. I stayed on as a ranger, walking the same trails in a familiar world that was now subtly, irrevocably altered. My colleagues stopped treating me like I was crazy. They probably just figured that whatever I had seen out there, whatever had happened during that long, terrifying summer, was enough to knock some sense into anyone. They weren't entirely wrong. Years have passed since that summer of 1995. Olympic National Park remains a place of breathtaking beauty and occasional danger. Hikers still sometimes go missing, as they do in any wilderness. But never again have we seen the kind of brutality, the senseless violence that marked the Hohawk's presence. Sometimes, on quiet nights when the mist rolls in from the Pacific and the ancient trees creak in the wind, I find myself thinking back to that clearing, to the moment when I stood face to face with something that shouldn't exist, something that challenged everything I thought I knew about the world. I've never seen anything like the Hohawk since that night. But I remain watchful. Because if there's one lesson I learned from all of this, it's that the line between our world and the world of spirits and monsters is thinner than we'd like to believe. The forest gives, and the forest takes. And sometimes, if we're very lucky, it allows us to glimpse the mysteries that lie hidden in its depths. We just have to be prepared for what we might find. As for me, Eli Blackbird, I continue to patrol these woods. Older now, a bit slower perhaps, but with eyes that see more clearly than ever before. Because someone needs to stand guard, to remember the old ways and the old stories. Someone needs to be ready, just in case the shadows in Olympic National Park ever decide to take form once again. It was late summer last year when I decided to go camping with two of my closest friends in British Columbia. We chose a popular campsite, hoping for a relaxing evening surrounded by nature. Little did we know that this ordinary camping trip would turn into the most terrifying experience of our lives. The day started off perfectly. We arrived at the campsite in the early afternoon, the sun still high in the sky, casting warm rays through the dense foliage of the surrounding forest. The air was crisp and clean, filled with the scent of pine and wildflowers. We set up our tent, unrolled our sleeping bags, and organized our gear, all while chatting excitedly about the night ahead. As we worked, I couldn't help but appreciate the beauty of our surroundings. The campsite was nestled in a small clearing, surrounded by towering evergreens that seemed to touch the sky. A gentle breeze rustled through the leaves, creating a soothing melody that complemented the distant sound of a rushing river. It was the perfect backdrop for what we hoped would be a memorable weekend getaway. Once our camp was set up, we decided to explore the area a bit. We followed a well-worn trail that led down to the river we had heard earlier. The water was crystal clear, flowing swiftly over smooth, multicolored pebbles. We spent some time skipping stones across the surface, competing to see who could get the most skips. The simple activity brought back fond memories of childhood camping trips, and we found ourselves sharing stories of past adventures in the great outdoors. As we made our way back to the campsite, we gathered firewood for the evening. The forest floor was littered with dry branches and twigs, perfect for starting a fire. We each took turns carrying armfuls of wood, joking about who could carry the most. It was during this task that we first noticed how quiet the forest seemed. Besides the occasional bird call or the rustling of leaves, there was an unusual stillness that we couldn't quite put our finger on. At the time, we brushed it off as nothing more than the peaceful tranquility of nature. Back at the campsite, we set about starting a fire. One of my friends was particularly skilled at this, having learned from his father, who was an avid outdoorsman. He carefully arranged the kindling and smaller twigs, then used a flint and steel to create a spark. Within minutes, we had a small but strong fire going. The crackling flames cast a warm glow around our site, creating a cozy atmosphere that instantly made us feel at home in the wilderness. As evening approached, we prepared our meal. We had brought along a portable camping stove, but decided to cook over the open fire for a more authentic experience. Our menu was simple but delicious: grilled vegetables and sausages, their aroma mixing with the wood smoke to create a mouth-watering scent that made our stomachs growl in anticipation. While the food cooked, we sat around the fire sharing stories and catching up on each other's lives. It had been a while since we had all been together like this, free from the distractions of work and daily responsibilities. There was something about being in nature that seemed to strip away the layers of stress and worry, allowing us to connect on a deeper level. As we ate our meal, we couldn't help but marvel at how much better food tastes when cooked outdoors. The smoky flavor of the fire infused every bite, and we savored each mouthful, washing it down with cold beers we had brought along in a cooler. The conversation flowed easily, punctuated by laughter and moments of comfortable silence as we gazed into the flames. After dinner, we opened a bottle of wine we had brought along for the occasion. The rich red liquid sparkled in the firelight as we poured it into our camping mugs. We toasted to friendship and adventure, completely unaware of what the night had in store for us. The wine added to the warmth of the fire and the good company, creating a perfect sense of contentment. Hours passed as we sat around the fire, sharing more stories, laughing, and enjoying each other's company. We talked about our hopes and dreams, our fears and insecurities. There's something about being in nature, away from the distractions of everyday life, that encourages deeper, more meaningful conversations. We discussed our careers, our relationships, and our plans for the future. It was one of those perfect moments of camaraderie that make camping trips so special. As the night wore on, the campsite around us grew quiet. Other campers retired to their tents, and the sounds of nature took over. The gentle rustling of leaves, the distant hoot of an owl, the soft gurgle of the nearby river. We were probably the only ones still awake, our voices now hushed as we continued our conversation under the star-studded sky. The night sky was a spectacle in itself. Away from the light pollution of the city, the stars shone with an intensity I had almost forgotten existed. We lay back on the ground, pointing out constellations and watching for shooting stars. The vastness of the universe above us put our own lives into perspective, making our worries seem small in comparison. It was during this peaceful stargazing that we first noticed something odd. The forest, which had been alive with the sounds of nocturnal creatures, suddenly fell silent. It was as if someone had flipped a switch, turning off all the ambient noise we had grown accustomed to. The silence was eerie and unnatural, sending a shiver down my spine despite the warmth of the fire. We sat up, looking at each other with confused expressions. One of my friends whispered, "Do you hear that?" But of course there was nothing to hear. The silence was absolute, broken only by the crackling of our fire and the sound of our own breathing. For a few minutes we sat in tense silence, straining our ears for any sound. Gradually, the normal nighttime noises resumed. An owl hooted in the distance, leaves rustled in the breeze. We laughed nervously, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling that had settled over us. We chalked it up to our imaginations running wild in the dark forest. To lighten the mood, we decided to tell ghost stories. It seemed fitting, given the atmosphere of the dark forest around us. We each took turns, trying to outdo each other with tales of haunted houses, vengeful spirits, and mysterious creatures lurking in the shadows. As we spoke, our voices hushed and dramatic. The forest seemed to press in around us, the darkness beyond our firelight growing deeper and more menacing. It was around 1 a.m. when everything changed. The peaceful night was suddenly shattered by a sound that sent chills down our spines. At first it was distant, a faint thumping that could have been easily dismissed as our imagination. But within seconds it grew louder, more insistent. It was unmistakably the sound of something large running towards us. The ground beneath us began to vibrate with each thunderous step. My heart raced, and I felt a primal fear unlike anything I had ever experienced before. I looked at my friends, their faces pale in the dying firelight, and I knew they felt the same overwhelming dread. Our first thought was that it must be a person, perhaps a fellow camper or a ranger, but as the footsteps grew closer, we realized that no human could make the earth shake like that. Whatever was charging towards us was massive, far larger than any man. The darkness beyond our campfire's glow seemed to deepen, as if the very night was conspiring to hide this terrifying entity from our sight. We strained our eyes, trying to catch a glimpse of what was approaching. But the contrast between our lit area and the pitch-black forest made it impossible to see anything. In those few seconds, which felt like an eternity, a million thoughts raced through my mind. Was it a bear? A moose? Or something we couldn't even imagine? The fear of the unknown amplified our terror tenfold. I found myself wishing for it to be a bear, as terrifying as that would be, because at least that was something I could understand, something that belonged in this world. The sound grew louder, closer, until it felt like it was right upon us. The ground shook with each step, and I could hear the snapping of branches and the rustling of leaves as whatever it was plowed through the underbrush. The fire, which had been our source of comfort all evening, now felt pathetically small and inadequate in the face of this unseen threat. Just as we thought the creature would burst into our campsite, we heard an enormous splash. Whatever it was had charged straight into the river beside our site. The sound of rushing water mixed with the thrashing of a large body, creating a cacophony that broke the spell of terror that had frozen us in place. Snapping out of our paralysis, we scrambled to our feet and ran towards our car. Hands shaking, I fumbled with the keys before managing to unlock the doors. We piled in, locking ourselves inside the relative safety of the vehicle. Our breaths came in short, panicked gasps as we peered out of the windows, trying to catch a glimpse of what had nearly run us down. For what felt like hours, we sat in the car, too afraid to move or speak above a whisper. We debated what it could have been, with a bear being the most logical explanation. But even as we said it aloud, none of us truly believed it. The feeling of absolute terror we had experienced seemed too intense, too otherworldly to have been caused by any ordinary animal. As we sat there, huddled together in the confines of the car, we tried to make sense of what had happened. We replayed the events in our minds, trying to remember any detail that might shed light on the nature of our unseen visitor. Had there been any unusual signs earlier in the day that we had overlooked? Had other campers mentioned anything strange? One of my friends suggested that perhaps it had been a prank, someone trying to scare campers for fun. But we quickly dismissed this idea. The footsteps we had heard were far too heavy, too powerful to have been made by a person, even someone wearing some kind of stilts or costume. As the adrenaline began to wear off, exhaustion set in. We were physically and emotionally drained from the experience. Despite our fear, we found ourselves drifting off to sleep in the cramped confines of the car, taking turns to stay awake and keep watch. As the first light of dawn began to break, we cautiously emerged from the car. The forest looked different in the pale morning light, less threatening, but somehow changed. It was as if the events of the night had stripped away the innocence of our surroundings, revealing a wilder, more unpredictable nature beneath the surface. We packed up our campsite in record time, constantly looking over our shoulders, jumping at every sound. The cheerful atmosphere of the previous day was gone, replaced by a tense silence broken only by the occasional whispered instruction or question. Before leaving, we examined the area around the river, looking for tracks or any sign of what had passed through. To our surprise and confusion, we found nothing. No footprints, no broken branches, no evidence at all of the massive creature that had terrified us so thoroughly. The lack of physical evidence was almost as unsettling as the experience itself. It made us question our own memories, our own senses. As we searched, we noticed other campers emerging from their tents, going about their morning routines as if nothing had happened. We approached a few, asking if they had heard anything unusual during the night. To our astonishment, no one else seemed to have noticed anything out of the ordinary. They spoke of a peaceful night's sleep, undisturbed by any strange noises or earth-shaking footsteps. Their obliviousness to our terrifying experience added another layer of confusion and doubt to our already shaken minds. How could something so massive, so earth-shaking, have gone unnoticed by everyone else in the campsite? It didn't make sense, and yet we couldn't deny what we had experienced. On the drive home, we tried to rationalize what had happened. We discussed all the possibilities: a bear, a moose, even the far-fetched idea of a Sasquatch. But none of our explanations seemed to fully capture the intensity of what we had experienced. The more we talked about it, the more surreal it seemed, like a shared nightmare that had somehow bled into reality. The days and weeks following our camping trip were filled with a mixture of fear, confusion, and an insatiable curiosity to understand what had happened. We scoured the internet for similar stories, reaching out to cryptozoology forums and local folklore groups. We found plenty of tales of strange encounters in the wilderness, but nothing that quite matched our experience. We even contacted the park rangers, hoping they might have some insight into what we had encountered. They listened to our story politely, but seemed skeptical. They assured us that while bears and other large wildlife were common in the area, there had never been any reports of anything matching the size and behavior of what we had experienced. Despite the lack of corroborating evidence or similar reports, none of us could shake the conviction that what we had experienced was real. The terror we had felt that night was too visceral, too intense to have been a product of our imaginations or a simple misunderstanding of natural phenomena. In the months that followed, our camping trip became a topic of endless discussion and speculation among our group of friends. Some were fascinated by our story, eager to hear every detail and offer their own theories. Others were skeptical, gently suggesting that perhaps our fears had gotten the better of us in the dark of night. The experience changed us in subtle ways. We found ourselves more aware of our surroundings, more attuned to the sounds of nature. Walks in the woods, once a source of peace and relaxation, now carried an undercurrent of tension, a heightened alertness to every snapping twig or rustling leaf. Despite this, or perhaps because of it, we found ourselves drawn back to the outdoors. We went on more camping trips, each time half hoping and half fearing that we might encounter something similar. But nothing ever came close to matching the intensity of that night. To this day, whenever we get together, the conversation inevitably turns to that night. We've researched local wildlife, spoken to park rangers, and even reached out to other campers who might have had similar experiences. But we've never found a satisfactory explanation for what happened. That camping trip remains the scariest thing that has ever happened to me. It's a reminder of how quickly a peaceful moment in nature can turn into something terrifying and unexplainable. While I still enjoy camping and outdoor activities, I've never been able to shake off the feeling that something out there in the wilderness defies our understanding. The experience has left me with a profound respect for the mysteries of the natural world. It's made me realize that despite all our knowledge and technology, there are still things out there that we can't explain, forces of nature that we can't control or fully comprehend. And on quiet nights, when the wind rustles through the trees, I sometimes find myself listening intently, half expecting to hear those thunderous footsteps once again. The memory of that night serves as a constant reminder that the world is a far stranger and more mysterious place than we often give it credit for. The fireflies appeared first as scattered sparks against the dark tree line, then gradually as an undulating wall of light stretching along the riverbank. Sitting outside my tent that first night on the Green River, I watched them pulse in waves, their glow reflecting off the water's surface. We were 45 miles from civilization, floating above the world's largest cave system, and I was beginning to understand what true isolation felt like. "Hey, anyone want the last of the trail mix?" Ben called from near our makeshift fire pit, his headlamp creating sharp shadows as he rummaged through our food bag. Maya and Kai, sprawled on their sleeping pads, both waved him off. We'd spent the entire day paddling under the July sun, our kayaks loaded with everything we needed for 3 nights on the river: tents, water filters, enough food to last the journey. The canoe, our supply vessel piloted by Kai, had proven harder to maneuver than expected through the rapids, but we'd managed. I'd known these 3 since college. Ben with his meticulous planning and endless energy, Maya who could navigate any rapids but hated spiders, and Kai who'd convinced us all to take this trip in the first place. "The Green River runs right above Mammoth Cave," he'd said during one of our weekend hiking trips. 400 miles of surveyed passageways right under our feet. When are we ever going to get another chance like this? None of us had expected the profound silence that descended once we'd paddled far enough downriver. No traffic noise, no distant sirens, not even the hum of electrical lines, just the sound of water over rocks, wind in the trees, and the occasional splash of a fish. It was beautiful, but something about that silence made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, like the river was holding its breath. The next day brought blistering heat and tired muscles as we navigated the meandering waterway. Our flotilla of 3 kayaks and 1 canoe moved steadily downstream, passing towering limestone cliffs and dense forest. We'd been on rivers before, but this felt different. The knowledge of what lay beneath, hundreds of miles of dark, twisting caves, added a weight to every shadow we passed. It was late afternoon when we found the lagoon. The sun had begun its descent, casting long shadows across the water, when Maya spotted the stream opening into the riverbank. As we pulled our boats closer, the sight stopped us cold. A spring poured from what looked like a cave mouth, creating a pool of startling blue that faded to black in its depths. The water was crystal clear, but so deep it seemed to swallow light. A pristine white sand beach stretched along one side, bordered by rising hills and a looming cliff face. "This is perfect," Kai said, already steering his canoe toward shore. "We can camp here tonight." The beach was better than perfect. Level, soft, with enough space for all our tents and a natural fire pit area. But as I helped unload the gear, something about the place set my teeth on edge. Maybe it was the way sound seemed to behave differently here, dampened by the hills and cliff. Maybe it was the small cave opening I spotted on the far side of the lagoon, a dark mouth about 3 feet wide that disappeared into blackness. Or maybe it was simply the weight of all that hollow earth beneath us, hundreds of feet of limestone riddled with unseen passages. I should have said something then, should have suggested we paddle another mile or 2 downstream, but everyone was tired, happy to have found such an ideal spot. Ben was already gathering firewood, Maya had started filtering water from the spring, and Kai was setting up his tent, humming contentedly. The sun sank lower, painting the cliff face in warm golden light, and I tried to shake off my unease. "You okay?" Maya asked, handing me a freshly filled water bottle. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "Just tired," I lied, forcing a smile. "Long day on the water." As darkness fell, we huddled around the small fire Ben had built, watching stars appear through gaps in the canopy above. The flames cast dancing shadows on the cliff behind us, and the spring water continued its eternal pour into the lagoon. The conversation drifted from river navigation to college memories to future plans, but I found myself growing quieter, more watchful as night deepened. When we finally crawled into our tents, exhaustion won out over my lingering anxiety. The last thing I remember before falling asleep was the sound of water flowing from that cave mouth, constant and ancient, carrying secrets from the depths below. The sound ripped me from sleep like a hook through water. It was around 5 a.m., the world outside my tent still wrapped in pre-dawn darkness. I'd woken needing to relieve myself, and was halfway through unzipping the tent flap when it came, a scream that turned my blood to ice. High-pitched at first, then dropping to a guttural tone that spoke of pain or fury or both. It came from my left, near our dying fire, no more than 10 feet away. My hands fumbled with the zipper, pulling it shut as quietly as possible. Years of camping experience told me it could be a fox, maybe a wild boar, even some kind of bird. But my instincts screamed that this was something different. The sound had carried too much weight, too much intention. For the next hour I lay perfectly still, barely breathing, straining to hear any movement outside. The soft sand of the beach should have made footsteps audible. Yet I heard nothing. No snapping twigs, no rustling leaves, no sound of retreat. Just the eternal pour of the spring water into the lagoon. My thoughts kept drifting to that small cave opening I'd spotted across the water, now hidden in darkness. 3 feet wide, large enough for something to emerge from the underground maze below. Sleep eventually reclaimed me, though I'm not sure how. When morning light filtered through the tent walls, I emerged to find my companions already up, Maya brewing coffee while Ben and Kai sorted through our food supplies. "You look rough," Ben said, passing me a granola bar. "Bad dreams?" I hesitated, then asked, "Did anyone else hear something last night? A scream or—" I trailed off, seeing their blank expressions. "Nothing but your snoring," Kai joked, but Maya was studying my face with concern. "What kind of scream?" she asked quietly. I described the sound as best I could, watching their reactions. Ben suggested a bobcat, while Kai theorized about the acoustics of the cave system possibly distorting normal animal sounds. Maya said nothing, but I caught her glancing at the cave opening across the lagoon. We broke camp efficiently, loading our boats under a sun that was already becoming oppressive. As I helped Maya secure her tent and her kayak, she suddenly said, "This place does feel different, like it's watching us." The day's paddling took us through increasingly remote stretches of river. The limestone cliffs grew taller, their faces pocked with small cave openings like empty eyes. We saw fewer signs of human presence, no distant buildings, no contrails in the sky, no other boats. Just the 4 of us, growing quieter as the day wore on. By late afternoon, storm clouds were building on the horizon. We needed to find our next camping spot before darkness or rain caught us on the water. The rocky beach appeared around a bend, a natural island where the river split into 2 channels. Pale rocks covered most of the surface, interspersed with tall grass and driftwood. It wasn't ideal, but it would have to do. "Watch out for the sand spiders," Ben called as we dragged our boats ashore. They were everywhere, scuttling between rocks alongside tiny frogs that leaped away from our footsteps. The place had an eerie quality, like a no man's land between water and earth. We set up camp with practiced efficiency, all of us aware of the darkening sky. Our tents formed a tight cluster on the most level ground we could find. Over dinner, we tried to lighten the mood by sharing river stories from past trips, but our laughter felt forced, swallowed by the vastness around us. "At least there aren't any cave openings here," Kai said, trying to tease me about my obvious unease at our previous campsite. I managed a weak smile, but the joke fell flat. We all felt it now, the weight of the wilderness, the sense that we were trespassing in ancient spaces. Sleep came quickly after the long day, but it wouldn't last. In the deepest part of the night, a sound exploded through the darkness like a bomb detonating. Mechanical, metallic, and impossibly loud. I shot upright in my sleeping bag, heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. It was like hearing a massive steel structure being torn apart, or a giant machine screaming in protest. The sound reverberated through the river valley, sending birds exploding from the trees in panic. "What the hell was that?" Maya's voice came from her tent, tight with fear. "Is everyone okay?" Ben called out, followed by the sound of his tent zipper. "Don't!" Kai's sharp command stopped him. "Just wait." We all fell silent, straining to hear through the thin walls of our tents. The normal nighttime sounds had vanished. No insects chirping, no frogs calling, no rustle of leaves in the breeze. The whole valley seemed to be holding its breath. "It had to be a tree falling," Ben said finally, but his voice lacked conviction. We'd all heard trees fall before. This was different. The sound had carried a deliberate quality, almost like a roar but twisted through metal and machinery. It had projected across the water with purpose, as if meaning to be heard. Nobody suggested shining a light toward the woods. Nobody volunteered to investigate. We lay in our tents, everyone pretending the sound had a logical explanation, everyone knowing it didn't. Sleep, when it finally came, was thin and troubled. Morning light revealed nothing. No fallen trees, no disturbed earth, no signs of anything that could have produced such an enormous sound. We packed up camp in record time, barely speaking as we loaded our boats. The river seemed different now, its surface too smooth, its depths too dark. "We should talk about what we heard," Maya said as we paddled downstream. "Both nights. Something's not right here." "It's just the caves," Kai insisted, but his knuckles were white on his paddle. "Sound carries weird and karst terrain. Probably mining operations or—" "There's no mining out here," Ben interrupted. "Nothing industrial for miles." I stayed quiet, remembering the scream from the first night, how it had seemed to come from nowhere and disappear into nothing. 2 nights, 2 inexplicable sounds, both carrying a quality that defied natural explanation. We pushed hard that final day, wanting to reach our takeout point before dark. The river wound through increasingly civilized areas, and gradually the tension began to ease. We even managed to joke about our sleepless night, though the laughter had a brittle edge. Years have passed since that trip, but the memories remain razor sharp. My friends and I still get together for outdoor adventures, still paddle rivers and camp under stars. We even returned to the Green River 2 years later, following the same route, carrying the same gear. That second trip was beautiful, but ordinary. No unexplained screams pierced the night. No mechanical roars shook the valley. We found the Blue Lagoon again, its waters still deep and mysterious, but the cave opening seemed smaller somehow, less significant. We camped on its beach without incident, though none of us slept quite as deeply as we might have elsewhere. When people ask about our scariest outdoor experience, we exchange glances but rarely share the full story. How do you explain sounds that shouldn't exist? How do you describe the feeling of being surrounded by wilderness that suddenly feels aware of your presence? The rational part of my mind has constructed explanations over the years. The scream could have been a fox or an owl, its sound distorted by the cliff walls. The mechanical roar might have been some distant industrial noise, carried for miles through the limestone caverns beneath our feet. Simple, logical answers that should put the matter to rest. But on quiet nights when I'm lying in my tent on other trips, I sometimes think about those hundreds of miles of surveyed passageways beneath the Green River. About how many more miles might remain unmapped, unknowable. About how the oldest caves in that system were formed millions of years ago, carved through darkness by underground rivers that still flow today. And I wonder if perhaps there are things in this world that exist in the spaces between our explanations. Things that sometimes make themselves known through impossible sounds in the night, through roars that shake the earth, through moments when the wilderness reminds us that we are merely visitors in spaces far older than our understanding. The Green River continues its ancient flow above the cave system, carrying its secrets. And somewhere in the darkness below, in those hundreds of miles of tunnels and passages, perhaps something still moves, still watches, still occasionally makes its presence known to those who venture too close to the boundaries between the world we know and the one we don't. We never did find a logical explanation for what we heard those nights. Maybe some mysteries are better left unsolved, some questions better left unasked. But I'll never forget the way the fireflies danced that first night, or how the silence felt after that mechanical roar, or the look in Maya's eyes when she spoke of feeling watched. Sometimes, the most profound experiences are the ones we can never fully explain. They remain with us like the echo of that scream in the darkness, like the ripples on the surface of that deep blue lagoon, reminding us that there will always be spaces in the wilderness that defy our need for rational understanding. And maybe that's exactly as it should be. The desert holds secrets in its silence. As a veteran nature photographer who has spent thousands of nights beneath star-filled skies, I thought I understood this fundamental truth. But on a series of nights in Arizona's Vermilion Cliffs, that understanding was shattered in ways that continue to haunt me years later. My name is Heron. For over 2 decades, I've dedicated my life to capturing Earth's most remarkable landscapes through my lens. As a BBC Earth Nat Geo portographer and cinematographer, I've documented everything from the ethereal dance of the northern lights to the raw power of active volcanoes. My work has taken me from the ice fields of Antarctica to the dense rainforests of Borneo, culminating in projects like HBO's Ice on Fire with Leonardo DiCaprio. But nothing in my extensive career could have prepared me for what transpired during those nights in the American Southwest. The events I'm about to share have remained largely private until now, confined to late-night conversations with trusted friends over warming whiskey. It wasn't fear of ridicule that kept me silent. When you've built a reputation documenting natural phenomena for organizations like the BBC, your credibility tends to speak for itself. Rather, it was the profound strangeness of what happened, the way it seemed to defy not just explanation, but the very rules of the natural world I'd spent my life observing. What finally compelled me to break my silence was a video about Skinwalker Ranch that a colleague recently shared. As I watched, the familiar chill of recognition crept down my spine. The parallels were undeniable, and suddenly I understood that perhaps our experience wasn't as isolated as we'd thought. To properly tell this story, I need to provide some context. My shooting partner Gavin Heffernan and I aren't weekend warriors or amateur photographers stumbling through the dark. We've conducted night shoots in all 50 U.S. states and every Canadian province, capturing the interplay of landscape and starlight in some of North America's most remote locations. When you've spent over 1,000 nights in the field, you develop an intimate understanding of the natural rhythms of darkness. You learn to differentiate between the movement of nocturnal animals, the play of shadows, and the subtle tricks that darkness can play on even the most experienced observers. Vermilion Cliffs. National Monument in Arizona had long been on our shot list. The location is a photographer's paradise, particularly the area known as White Pocket, a dreamlike expanse of swirling white lithified sandstone that seems more like a frozen ocean than a desert landscape. The rock formations there tell a story that stretches back 190 million years, their twisted striations recording ancient dunes, prehistoric tidal flats, and the inexorable forces of geological time. Getting to White Pocket requires serious effort. It's accessed via a labyrinth of unmarked sand tracks that challenge even the most capable four-wheel drive vehicles. The relative inaccessibility keeps the crowds away, which is precisely what we needed for our night photography. The BBC Earth short film we were working on required pristine dark skies, free from light pollution and human interference. We arrived in late afternoon, timing our setup to coincide with the golden hour. The air was crisp and clear, with a slight breeze that carried the subtle scent of sage and sun-baked stone. The forecast promised perfect conditions: clear skies, no moon, and unusually stable air that would allow for sharp star images. As the sun began its descent, the white sandstone caught fire with orange and pink hues, creating the kind of scene that reminds you why you chose this profession in the first place. Our equipment setup was extensive but routine. 6 professional-grade cameras, each mounted on carbon fiber tripods with specialized heads for precise astronomical tracking. We positioned them strategically across the landscape, each angle carefully chosen to capture different aspects of the relationship between the ancient stone formations and the eternal dance of stars overhead. The cameras were programmed for extended time-lapse sequences, their shutters set to click rhythmically through the night, recording the rotation of the Earth beneath the cosmic wheel of the Milky Way. With everything in place and the last light fading from the sky, we retreated to our small camp to get some sleep. We set alarms for 1 a.m., a standard practice that would allow us to wake and reposition the cameras for a second sequence of shots. The temperature was dropping steadily, and the silence of the desert wrapped around us like a thick blanket. Above, the first stars were beginning to pepper the darkening sky. It was during that prescribed 1 a.m. check that the first inexplicable event occurred. As I emerged from my tent, my headlamp cutting a sharp beam through the darkness, I noticed something that seemed out of place. Lights in the distance, where no lights should be. At first glance, they resembled headlights, and my initial reaction was annoyance at the thought of another vehicle disturbing our shoot. But as my mind processed what I was seeing, confusion set in. The lights were coming from a direction where there were no roads, no trails, nothing but protected wilderness stretching for miles. I nudged Gavin, who was already stirring, and pointed toward the anomaly. We stood in silence, watching. The more we observed, the less sense it made. The movement pattern suggested something smaller than vehicle lights, more akin to someone walking with a headlamp. But this raised even more questions. There were no hiking trails in that direction, and night hiking in this terrain would be not just foolish, but potentially lethal. "Maybe someone's lost," Gavin suggested. But his tone carried more question than conviction. We decided to wait, thinking that if it was indeed a distressed hiker, they might need assistance. The light continued its approach, growing bright enough to cast distinct reflections off the white rock formations around us. The effect was unsettling. The ancient stones seemed to pulse with an internal glow, their twisted forms taking on an almost organic quality in the strange illumination. Then, without warning or apparent cause, the light stopped. We maintained our vigil, straining our ears for any sound of movement, any call for help, but the desert offered only silence. The starlight was brilliant now, the Milky Way arching overhead in a glittering band, but even its familiar beauty felt somehow different, more mysterious than comforting. Minutes passed, and suddenly the lights reappeared, but something was wrong. They were now several miles from their previous position, a distance that would have been impossible for anyone to cover on foot in the elapsed time. The realization sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the desert night air. In all my years of photography, in all the remote locations I'd visited, I'd never experienced anything that so completely defied rational explanation. That first inexplicable event was enough to keep us from returning to our tents. Instead, we spent the remainder of the night beside our cameras, taking comfort in their steady, mechanical clicks and each other's presence. As the eastern sky began to lighten, we discussed what we'd seen, trying to force it into some kind of logical framework. Under normal circumstances, we might have dismissed it as an unusual but ultimately explainable occurrence. But what happened the following night would eliminate any possibility of simple explanation. Our next location was the Wave, one of the most coveted photographic destinations in the American Southwest. Access is strictly controlled. Only 20 permits are issued daily, a limitation that helps preserve the site's pristine nature. The hike in is challenging, especially laden with photography equipment. 3 miles of unmarked trail wind through the desert, requiring careful navigation even in daylight. The Wave itself is a testament to the artistry of erosion, a series of massive sandstone formations worn smooth by ancient rivers long since vanished. The rock swirls in mesmerizing patterns of red, orange, and yellow, creating a natural amphitheater that seems almost too perfectly formed to be the work of random geological processes. During the day, it's spectacular. At night, it becomes something else entirely. The acoustics of the location would prove significant in what followed. The curved stone walls create a natural amplification system. Even the smallest sounds carry with remarkable clarity. A pebble skittering down a slope half a mile away echoes like a gunshot. The soft pad of a desert fox's paws can be heard from hundreds of yards distant. This natural surveillance system was one of the reasons we chose the spot. It would alert us to any approaching wildlife that might disturb our equipment. We arrived late afternoon, timing our hike to reach the site with enough daylight to set up our gear. The air was still, without even the whisper of a breeze. Temperature inversions are common here at dusk, creating layers of air that can produce mirages and distort sound in strange ways. But this evening was different. The atmosphere seemed preternaturally stable, as if the desert itself was holding its breath. Our setup routine was methodical, born of years of experience. Each camera position was chosen carefully, tripods adjusted with bubble levels, settings checked and double-checked. The golden hour brought out the rich colors of the stone, and we captured several spectacular time-lapse sequences of the sunset, painting the walls in increasingly dramatic hues. As darkness fell, the stars emerged with startling clarity. The Wave's remote location and high elevation make it one of the darkest sites in the region. On a moonless night like this, you can barely see your hand in front of your face without artificial light. We set our alarms for 1 a.m., following the same routine as the previous night. The temperature had dropped significantly, and our breath formed small clouds in the beam of our headlamps as we made final adjustments to the equipment. The only sounds were the soft clicks of our camera shutters and the occasional distant cry of a coyote. Sleep came fitfully. Perhaps it was the residual unease from the previous night's experience, or maybe some primal instinct was already warning us that something wasn't right. The alarm's soft chime at 1 a.m. was almost a relief. We emerged from our sleeping bags into the absolute darkness, our headlamps creating small islands of visibility in the void. The first sign that something was wrong came when I returned to check one of my primary cameras. The spot where I'd left it, a position I'd chosen specifically for its clear view of the constellation Orion rising over the rock formations, was empty. Not just the camera, but the entire tripod was gone. At first, I doubted myself. When you're working in near total darkness, it's easy to become disoriented. But I'd been doing this long enough to have developed systems to prevent exactly this kind of confusion. I had taken reference photos of each camera position with my phone, marking them against distinctive features in the rock. I checked these now, my hands shaking slightly as I swiped through the images. There was no mistake. The camera should have been there. I called out to Gavin, trying to keep my voice steady. He confirmed my memory. He'd watched me set up at that exact spot, had even suggested adjusting the angle slightly to catch the reflection of starlight off the polished stone. We began searching the area, our headlamp beams crisscrossing in the darkness. The camera was expensive equipment, but that wasn't what worried us. It was the impossibility of its disappearance. Remember the acoustics I mentioned? In this natural amphitheater, any movement would have been audible. A human would have been heard approaching from hundreds of yards away. Even a small animal moving the tripod would have created unmistakable sounds. We had heard nothing. Not a footstep, not a scrape, not a single sound out of place. We stood in absolute silence, straining our ears for any hint of movement or the familiar click of the camera's shutter. The night pressed in around us, the stars overhead seeming somehow closer and colder than before. That's when we heard it, a sound that had no business existing in that place and time. A thud, sharp and distinctive, echoed through the canyon. It wasn't distant or muffled, but close enough to make us both jump. We turned toward the sound, our light beams searching the darkness. What we found defied explanation. One of our other cameras, one that had been securely mounted on a professional-grade tripod with legs spread wide for stability, was lying on its side. The camera was still functioning, its shutter clicking away steadily, a sound we absolutely would have heard earlier when we were listening intently for any sign of the missing equipment. The fall itself made no sense. As professionals, we're obsessive about stability. Our tripods are set up with wide bases and weighted for additional security. This wasn't a case of equipment slowly becoming unbalanced and tipping over. The position of the fallen camera suggested it had been dropped or pushed with considerable force. Gavin, who prides himself on his rational, scientific mindset, turned to me with an expression I'll never forget. "I'm an atheist," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "but this one's making me wonder." The words hung in the air, carrying more weight than either of us wanted to acknowledge. We spent the remainder of the night in tense vigilance, our backs literally against the rock wall, watching our remaining cameras and listening to the darkness. The steady click of shutters became our metronome, marking time until dawn. We didn't speak much. What was there to say? We had just witnessed something that shouldn't have been possible, something that challenged our understanding of reality itself. As the first hints of dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, we packed up our remaining equipment with unusual haste. The missing camera never reappeared. We searched again in the growing light, but found no trace of it. No tracks, no scrape marks. Nothing to suggest what might have happened during those dark hours. The drive back to civilization was quiet, each of us lost in our own thoughts. At a dusty intersection outside of Page, Arizona, we parted ways, Gavin heading back to Los Angeles while I continued on to my next planned shoot at Waterholes Canyon. Looking back, I wish I had recognized the pattern that was emerging, had understood that each location was drawing us deeper into something we couldn't comprehend. But I was still trying to rationalize what had happened, still clinging to the belief that there must be some logical explanation. Waterholes Canyon was supposed to be different. Unlike the remote locations of the previous nights, this site lay just beneath State Highway 89, about 5 miles south of Page. The constant hum of traffic overhead should have been reassuring, a reminder of civilization's proximity. I tried to convince myself that the strange events of the past 2 nights would feel less threatening in the light of day, less real somehow. I was wrong. The canyon itself is less celebrated than its neighbors like Antelope Canyon, but it holds its own stark beauty. Narrow walls of striated sandstone rise on either side, carved by millennia of flash floods into smooth, undulating forms. The plan was simple. Capture the modern architecture of the highway bridge framed against the ancient rock, with the Milky Way arcing overhead. A study in contrasts, man-made precision suspended above nature's fluid artistry. I arrived in mid-afternoon to scout locations, wanting plenty of time to plan my shots before darkness fell. The air was different here, heavier, more stagnant than the open spaces of White Pocket or the Wave. As I descended the trail into the canyon, the temperature dropped noticeably. That's when I first noticed the smell. Initially, it was just a hint of something out of place, barely noticeable beneath the usual desert scents of dust and creosote. But as I moved deeper into the canyon, it became more pronounced. Anyone who spent time in the wilderness develops a catalog of natural odors: the musty scent of wet stone, the sharp tang of animal markings, the sweet decay of organic matter. This was different. Wrong. The smell grew stronger as I approached the area beneath the bridge. The concrete support structures created sharp shadows against the red rock, geometric shapes that seemed to slice through the natural flow of the canyon walls. I was marking potential camera positions in my mind when I saw it, a dark shape near one of the bridge supports that didn't match the surrounding patterns. My first thought was that someone had illegally dumped trash in the canyon. It's an unfortunately common problem in areas close to highways. But as I drew closer, the shape resolved itself into something far more disturbing. What I had initially taken for a dead dog was actually a coyote. But its positioning was strange. It hadn't fallen from above or dragged itself there to die. The body lay as if carefully placed, arranged even. The wrongness of the scene made me hesitate, but professional curiosity drew me closer. I've photographed dead animals before. It's part of documenting the natural world honestly, but this was different. The coyote's bottom jaw was missing, along with its tongue. The removal was precise, almost surgical. There were no signs of struggle, no blood on the surrounding rock, just clean, precise excision that defied natural explanation. The technical part of my mind, the part trained to observe and document, noted these details even as another part screamed at me to leave. The cuts were too precise for any predator, too clean for scavengers. The placement too deliberate for accident or natural death. And the timing. Was it coincidence that I found this after 2 nights of inexplicable events? I backed away, my camera still in its bag, unused. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows through the canyon, and suddenly every dark space seemed to hold potential threats. The bridge overhead, which had earlier represented a reassuring link to civilization, now felt like it was trapping me in the narrow space below. The climb out of the canyon took half the time of my descent. I didn't run. Professional photographers learn early that panicking in rough terrain is a good way to get hurt. But I moved with purpose, stopping only once I reached my vehicle. The sun was setting as I pulled onto Highway 89, heading north toward Page. I didn't look back. That was my last shoot in the Vermilion Cliffs area. I've never returned despite numerous opportunities and requests from clients. The rational part of my mind says this is ridiculous, that I've worked in far more remote and dangerous locations without incident. I've photographed active volcanoes, tracked polar bears on the Arctic ice, and camped alone in territories where large predators roam freely. But something about those 3 nights in Arizona touched a deeper kind of fear, not of physical danger, but of having to confront something that shouldn't exist in our understood world. For years, I filed these experiences away in the category of things better left unexamined. I shared the story occasionally with close friends, usually late at night when the boundaries between possible and impossible feel more permeable. Their reactions ranged from skepticism to fascination, but none could offer explanations that satisfied both the evidence and logic. It wasn't until I watched that video about Skinwalker Ranch that the memories came flooding back with new context. The similarities were striking: the unexplained lights, the mysterious movement of objects, the strange animal incidents. For the first time, I felt like maybe our experience wasn't isolated, that perhaps it was part of a larger pattern I still don't understand. The Vermilion Cliffs region has always been steeped in mystery. Native American tribes have long considered certain areas sacred, warning of places where the boundary between worlds grows thin. Modern visitors report strange phenomena: lights in the desert, unexplained sounds, time seeming to flow differently in certain locations. Most of these stories are dismissed as the product of isolation and imagination, the mind playing tricks in a landscape that already seems to defy natural law. But I know what I saw. More importantly, I know what I didn't see. There were no tracks around our missing camera, no wind to topple equipment, No logical explanation for lights that moved miles in minutes. The coyote's injuries defied both predator and scavenger behavior. Each incident on its own might be explainable, but together they form a pattern that points to something beyond our normal understanding of reality. As a documentary photographer, my career is built on observing and recording the natural world. My work requires technical precision and attention to detail, leaving little room for imagination or embellishment. The events I've described here stand in direct conflict with everything I understand about how the world works. And yet they happened, as real as the ground beneath our feet or the stars overhead. I've often wondered about the missing camera, what it might have recorded during those dark hours, what images might be stored on its memory card. Sometimes I imagine it's still out there somewhere in the twisted landscape of the wave, its shutter continuing to click away, documenting things we're not meant to see. The experience changed how I approach my work in subtle ways. I'm more cautious now about shooting alone in remote locations, more aware of the thin line between the world we think we understand and whatever lies beyond that understanding. When I set up my cameras under the stars, I find myself paying more attention to the shadows, to the spaces between things. But perhaps the most lasting impact has been on my perspective as a natural historian. Through my lens, I've documented countless wonders of the natural world, phenomena that would seem impossible if we hadn't studied and understood them. Maybe what we encountered in those canyons was simply something else waiting to be understood, another mystery for future generations to unravel. Until then, the red cliffs and white stones continue their silent vigil under the desert stars. They hold their secrets close, revealing them only in fragments to those who venture into the darkness. And somewhere in that vast wilderness, there's a camera with my name on it, perhaps still recording images of things that defy explanation. I don't expect everyone to believe this story. As a professional observer of the natural world, I'm still not sure I believe it myself. But I know what I saw, what Gavin saw, what we experienced over those 3 nights in the desert. And I know that sometimes the most honest thing we can say about the world is that it's bigger, stranger, and more mysterious than we can imagine. The lights I saw that first night at White Pocket still appear in my dreams sometimes. In those dreams, I finally discover what lies at their source. But when I wake, the answer always slips away, like sand through my fingers, leaving only questions and the lingering sense that some mysteries are better left unexplored. For now, I continue my work, documenting the world's wild places through my lens. But I no longer assume that what I capture in my viewfinder represents the full scope of what exists in those remote landscapes. Sometimes, when I'm setting up a night shot in some distant location, I find myself glancing over my shoulder, watching the darkness between the stars. And sometimes, just sometimes, I think the darkness watches back. The sun was just peeking over the horizon on October 12, 2023, casting long shadows across the dense pine forest of the Appalachian Mountains. I had been up since dawn, methodically packing my gear for what was supposed to be a routine solo hunting trip. At 34, these solitary excursions had become my therapy, my escape from the suffocating pressures of modern life. The crisp autumn air was invigorating, and the scent of pine needles underfoot provided a welcome respite from the stale odor of Pittsburgh, where I'd been living for the past 5 years. My name's Emerson Voss, and these mountains run in my blood. I grew up in these parts, learning to hunt from my father when I was barely tall enough to see over his pickup truck's dashboard. He was a patient teacher, drilling into me the importance of respect for the weapon, for the wildlife, and most importantly, for the wilderness itself. I remember my first deer at 12 years old, a young doe, nothing spectacular, but it marked my transition from observer to hunter, These days, though, hunting had evolved into something different for me. It wasn't about the kill anymore. It was about finding silence in a world that never seemed to quiet down. The old Ford F-150 groaned as I pulled off onto a familiar dirt road, the suspension protesting against decades of use. I grabbed my Remington 700 from the gun rack, checked it one last time, and shouldered my pack. The weight felt reassuring, each item carefully chosen. Emergency supplies, first aid kit, water, food, basic camping gear. 20 years of experience had taught me exactly what I needed and nothing more. As I started down the trail, my mind drifted to the argument I'd had with Cassidy the night before. 3 years together, and we still couldn't agree on these hunting trips. "It's not natural," she'd said, "being out there alone." Maybe she had a point, but the forest had always felt more natural to me than any city street. The well-worn path led me deeper into the wilderness, each step carrying me further from civilization. About an hour in, I reached my favorite spot, a small clearing that offered good sight lines and natural cover. I'd taken 2 bucks from this location over the years, but today, something felt off. The usual chorus of birdsong seemed muted, the forest holding its breath. I set up my simple camp, a lean-to shelter made from a lightweight tarp, a small fire pit ringed with stones, and my gear arranged for easy access. The morning stretched into afternoon without much activity. A few squirrels, some songbirds, but no sign of deer. The unusual quiet began to wear on me, creating an itch between my shoulder blades that wouldn't go away. By mid-afternoon, I decided to scout a new location. The shadows had lengthened, and the temperature had dropped several degrees. I packed efficiently, leaving no trace of my presence, and headed deeper into the forest. The trees seemed to press closer here, their branches interweaving overhead to create a natural canopy that blocked most of the remaining daylight. I found a promising spot, a natural ridge overlooking a small valley, giving me clear views of several game trails that converged below. Setting up my observation post, I pulled out my Nikon binoculars and began systematically scanning the area. That's when I saw it, a movement that didn't belong. In 2 decades of hunting these mountains, I'd learned to recognize the patterns of wildlife. Deer move with a distinctive grace, bears with a lumbering purpose, coyotes with predatory intent. This was different. The shape I glimpsed through the trees was massive, easily 7 feet tall, and it moved with an unsettling combination of precision and raw power. My hand steadied as I raised my rifle, muscle memory taking over as I peered through the scope. The creature had disappeared behind a thicket, but something about its movement had set off every survival instinct I possessed. Then I heard it, a sound that had no place in these mountains. Low and guttural, it resonated through the trees like the growl of some prehistoric beast. My heart rate accelerated, but my training kept me still. Years of hunting had taught me the value of patience, of waiting for the right moment. But as the minutes ticked by and the shadows grew longer, a new sensation crept in, the unmistakable feeling of being watched. The decision to return to camp wasn't born of panic, but of pragmatism. Whatever I'd seen wasn't normal game, and the rapidly approaching darkness would put me at a severe disadvantage. I moved carefully, maintaining awareness of my surroundings while trying to make as little noise as possible. The journey back seemed longer, each shadow and sound amplified by my heightened senses. The forest had grown unnaturally quiet, the usual nighttime chorus of insects and nocturnal creatures conspicuously absent. When I finally reached my campsite, the last traces of daylight were fading from the sky. I quickly built a fire, not for warmth, but for light and the primal security it provided. My hands moved automatically through the familiar motions, gathering kindling, arranging the wood, striking the ferro rod. The flames caught quickly, and I positioned myself with my back to a large pine tree, rifle across my knees. Hours passed in tense vigilance. The fire burned low, and I deliberately didn't feed it, letting my eyes adjust to the darkness beyond its diminishing light. That's when I heard it again. The same guttural sound, but closer now. Much closer. My fingers tightened on the rifle's stock as I scanned the tree line. The moonlight cast strange shadows, playing tricks on my eyes, until suddenly, there. Two eyes reflected the dying firelight, set too high off the ground to belong to any normal predator. They glowed with an amber intelligence that struck me as terrifyingly aware. The creature stepped into the clearing, and my world shifted on its axis. It moved on two legs, but with a fluidity that seemed impossible for its size. Matted fur covered its massive frame, and its face. God, its face was wrong. A nightmarish fusion of ursine and primate features that defied classification. But it was the eyes that held me. They weren't the eyes of an animal, but something else entirely. Training took over. I raised the rifle in one smooth motion, centering the crosshairs on the creature's head. Time seemed to slow as I drew breath, finger tightening on the trigger. The shot shattered the night's silence, but in the split second between firing and impact, the creature moved with impossible speed. The round grazed its shoulder instead of finding its mark, and then it was on me. The impact felt like being hit by a truck, the rifle torn from my grasp as we crashed to the ground. The creature's breath was hot on my face, its weight crushing. Instinct and desperation drove my hand to the hunting knife on my belt. The blade sank into matted fur and flesh, drawing a roar that seemed to shake the very air. Claws raked across my chest, tearing through jacket and skin with equal ease. Pain exploded across my torso, but adrenaline kept me fighting. I stabbed again and again, each thrust guided by pure survival instinct. The creature's movements began to slow, its attacks becoming less coordinated. With one final desperate surge of strength, I drove the knife deep into its throat. Hot blood poured over my hands as the beast convulsed, its weight nearly crushing me before it finally went still. Getting out from under the creature's body took every ounce of strength I had left. I stumbled to my feet, body screaming in pain, blood both mine and the creature's, soaking my clothes. The rational part of my mind tried to make sense of what had just happened, but the primal part knew only one truth. I needed to get out of there. I grabbed my pack and rifle, leaving the rest of the gear behind. The journey back to my truck passed in a blur of pain and paranoia, every shadow holding potential threats. When I finally reached the vehicle, my hands shook so badly, I dropped the keys twice before managing to get them in the ignition. The dashboard clock read 1:47 a.m. when I pulled into the parking lot of the Clearfield County Sheriff's Office. Sheriff Hank Mercer was working late, thankfully. He took one look at me and called for an ambulance, but I refused to leave until I'd told him everything. "We need to go back," I insisted, even as the EMTs tried to treat my wounds. "Whatever that thing is, we need to find it." Hank, to his credit, took me seriously. Maybe it was the blood, or maybe he saw something in my eyes that convinced him. He assembled a team of deputies, and by dawn we were back at my campsite. The creature's body lay where I'd left it, a massive dark shape in the morning light. The discovery set off a chain of events I never could have predicted. Dr. Lawrence Redding, a wildlife biologist from Penn State, arrived that afternoon. His examination of the creature led to more questions than answers. Blood samples were taken, tissue samples preserved, measurements recorded. The body was transported to a secure facility at the university for further study. The official report, released 6 months later, raised more questions than it answered. DNA analysis showed something unprecedented, a previously unknown species of great ape, but with significant genetic variations that defied explanation. Dr. Redding's team identified pronounced adaptations for cold weather survival and nighttime hunting, suggesting a long-term presence in the Appalachian ecosystem. The media circus was intense, but mercifully brief. Without access to the body or DNA results, most outlets treated it as just another cryptid story. Those who knew the truth kept quiet, understanding the implications of such a discovery. I've spent countless hours since that night trying to make sense of it all. The creature's existence suggests blind spots in our understanding of North American wildlife that seem impossible in the modern age. Yet there I was, with the scars to prove it wasn't a dream or hallucination. Cassidy stood by me through it all, even as I struggled with nightmares and jumped at shadows. We moved to Colorado last year, her idea, and a good one. The Rockies are different enough from the Appalachians that I've started hunting again, though never alone. The thing that haunts me isn't the attack itself, but the intelligence I saw in those eyes. Whatever I encountered that night, it wasn't just some undiscovered animal. It was something that had successfully hidden from human detection for centuries. Something that chose that moment to reveal itself. Sometimes on quiet nights when sleep won't come, I find myself wondering, how many more are out there, watching and waiting in the dark places of the world? And more importantly, what made this one decide to show itself? I don't have answers to these questions, and maybe that's for the best. Some mysteries aren't meant to be solved, some truths better left in the shadows of those ancient mountains. But I know one thing for certain. The next time Cassidy says something doesn't feel natural, I'll listen. November 15th, 2023. The first frost of winter had settled over western Oklahoma when I found myself deep in the rugged terrain of the Ouachita Mountains. I'm Dean Arledge, 42 years old, and hunting has been my sanctuary for as long as I can remember. These mountains aren't the towering peaks you'd find out west. They're ancient, worn down by time, but they harbor their own kind of wildness. The locals call them the Old Mountains, and there's something fitting about that name. I'd taken a week off from my job at the manufacturing plant in Lawton. The stress had been building up. Layoffs, budget cuts, the constant hum of machinery that seemed to follow me home every night. The mountains were my escape, had been since my father first taught me to hunt here 25 years ago. The morning started like any other hunting trip. I'd loaded up my Ford F-150 before dawn, my Remington 700 secured in its case, pack filled with supplies, and enough water for a full day in the field. The drive from Lawton took about an hour, the sun just starting to paint the eastern sky when I turned onto the dirt access road that wound into the wildlife management area. The Ouachitas in November have their own particular beauty. The oak and hickory trees stand bare against the sky, their leaves carpeting the forest floor in shades of brown and gold. The scattered pines provide the only green, their needles rustling in the crisp morning breeze. I'd been hunting these woods for decades, knew the trails and valleys like the back of my hand, or at least I thought I did. I parked at my usual spot, an old pull-off marked only by a weather-beaten reflector nailed to a tree. The location was perfect, far enough from the main roads to avoid other hunters, but not so remote that it would be dangerous if something went wrong. I checked my phone, 1 bar of service. Not great, but enough to call for help if needed. I made a mental note of the time, 6:45 a.m. The ritual of preparing for the hunt was familiar, almost meditative. I pulled on my orange safety vest over my camouflage jacket, checked my rifle, and secured my pack. The weight of the gun was reassuring as I slung it over my shoulder. I'd added a few new items to my gear this season, a high-powered flashlight, a GPS unit, and a more comprehensive first aid kit. Better safe than sorry, my father always said. The hike to my preferred hunting spot took longer than usual. Recent rains had left the ground soft, and fallen leaves concealed treacherous mud patches. The morning air was sharp in my lungs, carrying the scent of decaying vegetation and damp earth. As I walked, I noticed signs of deer activity, fresh tracks in the mud, broken twigs at browse height, beds pressed into the leaf litter. After about an hour of careful hiking, I reached the rise where I planned to set up my blind. It was a natural vantage point overlooking a well-used game trail, with a dense thicket of young oaks providing cover. The portable blind was quick to set up, a simple pop-up design in fall camouflage pattern. Inside, I arranged my gear and settled into my folding chair, rifle rested on the shooting stick, ready for a long wait. The morning passed slowly, marked by the gradual warming of the air and the changing angle of sunlight filtering through the canopy. I'd always enjoyed these quiet hours, the way they allowed my mind to empty of everyday concerns. The forest was alive with small sounds, chickadees calling from the underbrush, a red-tailed hawk screaming somewhere overhead, the endless rustle of leaves in the wind. Around noon, I unwrapped the sandwich I'd packed, turkey and Swiss on rye, a bit squashed from being in my pack. As I ate, I scanned the surrounding forest through the blind's viewing ports, more out of habit than expectation. Deer movement would be minimal during these middle hours. The shadows had shortened, the sun nearly directly overhead, creating patches of bright light between the trees. The first indication that something was wrong came at 2:17 p.m. I remember checking my watch because the sudden silence was so striking it made me conscious of time again. The constant background chorus of birds and small animals cut off as if someone had flipped a switch. In 2 decades of hunting, I'd experienced this phenomenon before, usually when a predator entered the area. Typically, it meant a coyote or bobcat was passing through, but this silence was different, more complete, more final. The air seemed to thicken, making each breath feel deliberate and insufficient. A pressure built in my ears, like the moment before a thunderstorm breaks. But the sky, visible in patches through the canopy, remained clear and cold. I raised my binoculars, scanning the forest with practiced movements. The familiar landscape suddenly seemed alien, shadows too deep, distances distorted. Through the magnified view, I caught movement at the edge of a thicket about 80 yards out. My first thought was deer, but the motion was wrong, too fluid, too purposeful. The silence stretched on, broken only by the sound of my own breathing, which seemed impossibly loud in the still air. My hand moved to my rifle, more from instinct than conscious thought. Years of hunting had taught me to trust my gut, and every instinct was screaming that something was deeply wrong. At 2:43 p.m., the first deer appeared. It burst from the undergrowth at a full run, moving faster than I'd ever seen a deer move. Its eyes were wide, showing white all around, and foam flecked its muzzle. Before I could process what I was seeing, 2 more deer followed, equally panicked. They weren't fleeing in a straight line, but zigzagging erratically, as if trying to shake a pursuit. In all my years of hunting, I'd never seen deer behave like this. They're cautious animals by nature, preferring to slip away quietly unless directly threatened. This blind panic suggested something had thoroughly terrified them. I raised my rifle, not to shoot, but to use the scope as a more powerful set of eyes. Through the magnified view, I swept the area where the deer had emerged. The shadows between the trees seemed to shift and dance, playing tricks with my depth perception. Then I saw it, or rather saw something that my mind couldn't quite process. At first glance, it appeared to be a shadow detached from its source, moving independently of the swaying branches overhead. But as I focused, details emerged that made my mouth go dry. The shape was roughly humanoid, but wrong in ways that defied easy description. It moved with an unsettling grace, joints bending at impossible angles, limbs too long and sinuous to be human. The rational part of my mind tried to categorize what I was seeing: bear, mountain lion, even a person in some kind of costume. But none of these explanations fit what my eyes were telling me. The creature moved like liquid shadow, flowing between trees with an organic grace that seemed both beautiful and obscene. My finger tensed on the trigger, though I hadn't made a conscious decision to shoot. The crosshairs centered on the moving shape, but something stopped me from pulling the trigger. Some deep, primitive part of my brain warned that shooting would only make things worse. Instead, I watched through the scope as the creature paused in a shaft of sunlight. For a brief moment, I could see it clearly, or as clearly as my mind would allow. Its body was covered in what looked like matted fur, but patches were missing, revealing skin that seemed to shift and ripple like oil on water. The head was the worst part, a combination of features that seemed borrowed from different predators, dominated by eyes that reflected the sunlight like mirrors. The creature's head snapped toward my blind with impossible speed, as if it had sensed my gaze. Those reflective eyes seemed to stare directly into mine through the scope, and in that moment, I felt something brush against my mind, an alien consciousness, ancient and hungry. I recoiled from the scope, my heart hammering against my ribs. The blind suddenly felt like a trap rather than shelter. I needed to move, to run, but my legs wouldn't respond. The silence in the forest had become absolute. Even the wind seemed to have died. A sound broke the stillness, a slow scraping, like claws on bark. It was close, too close. The walls of the blind seemed paper thin, offering no protection from what waited outside. The scraping moved around the blind, circling, testing. I raised my rifle again, aiming at the blind's wall where the sound was loudest. The creature made a sound then. Not a growl or roar, but a series of clicks and whistles that reminded me disturbingly of human speech. The sound seemed to come from multiple directions at once, as if the creature was in several places simultaneously. The wall of the blind bulged inward slightly, and I saw the impression of what might have been fingers, too many fingers, too long and jointed wrong, pressing against the fabric. The material dimpled under the pressure but didn't tear. I fired. The report of the rifle was deafening in the confined space. The creature screamed, a sound that started like a mountain lion's scream but shifted into something that might have been words in a language too old for human tongues. The pressure against the blind vanished. I burst out of the blind, rifle ready, spinning to cover all directions. The forest was a blur of shadows and movement. I caught glimpses of something large moving through the trees, but it never stayed still long enough for me to get a clear shot. The rational part of my mind was screaming at me to run, to get back to my truck, but I couldn't shake the feeling that turning my back would be fatal. I began a fighting retreat, moving backward along the path I'd taken in, rifle sweeping back and forth. The creature paced me, staying just out of clear sight, occasionally making those horrible clicking sounds. Once it seemed to laugh, a wet burbling sound that made my skin crawl. I fired twice more at moving shadows, but I don't think I hit anything. The walk back to my truck became a nightmare marathon. Every shadow might have been the creature, every sound a potential attack. The forest I knew so well had become a maze of threat and confusion. Branches seemed to reach for me, roots tried to trip me, and all the while those clicking sounds followed. I nearly wept with relief when I saw my truck through the trees. I covered the last 50 yards at a sprint, yanked open the door, and threw myself inside. The key was in the ignition and the engine roaring before I fully registered my own movement. As I slammed the truck into reverse, I looked up at my rearview mirror. The creature stood at the edge of the clearing, fully visible in the fading daylight. It raised one impossibly long arm in what might have been a wave, then seemed to fold in on itself, disappearing into a shadow that should have been too small to contain it. I didn't stop driving until I reached the ranger station at the park's entrance. The rangers were skeptical of my story, but something in my face must have convinced them to investigate. They found my blind, shredded from the inside out. They found tracks, too. Prints that made no biological sense, with too many toes and joints that suggested a leg structure unknown to science. The official report blamed a bear, possibly rabid, explaining away both the tracks and the deer's panic. The rangers increased patrols in the area and posted warnings about aggressive wildlife. They conducted a thorough search but found nothing unusual. I knew better. That was 3 months ago. I haven't been hunting since, though I know I'll have to go back eventually. The mountains are in my blood and I can't stay away forever. But I've made changes. I've installed security cameras around my property. I've reinforced my doors and windows. I've bought more powerful weapons. Because sometimes, late at night, I hear clicking sounds outside my window. And sometimes, when I look out at the tree line behind my house, I see eyes reflecting the moonlight. Eyes that shouldn't be that high off the ground. I know it followed me home. I know it's watching, waiting. And I know that someday it will do more than watch. But I'll be ready. The authorities have closed their investigation. The incidents have been officially attributed to natural causes. Life in the nearby towns has returned to normal. But the locals don't go into certain parts of the Ouachitas anymore, especially not alone, especially not near dusk. They say the mountains are ancient, that they hold secrets. I believe them now. I believe there are things in this world that defy explanation, things that live in the spaces between what we know and what we fear, and I believe they're hungry. Yesterday started like many of my restless days in the city, with that familiar itch for wilderness creeping under my skin around mid-morning. You know the feeling, when the walls of your apartment seem to close in, and the sound of traffic outside your window becomes unbearable. The incessant honking of impatient drivers, the mechanical whir of construction equipment, and the constant chatter of pedestrians formed a suffocating cocoon of urban noise that made my skin crawl. I'd been working from home for months now, and the isolation had begun to wear on me in unexpected ways. My one-bedroom apartment, once a cozy refuge, had transformed into a cage of monotony, its white walls reflecting back my growing restlessness with each passing hour. I spent hours hunched over my laptop, scrolling through camping sites and recreation areas, tabs multiplying like rabbits as I researched possible destinations. The blue light from my screen cast an artificial glow across my face as I dove deeper into forums and review sites, searching for that perfect escape from the concrete jungle that surrounded me. My cursor hovered over the Book Now button for a car share service that would take me beyond Portland's sprawling suburbs, but by then, the golden afternoon light was already slanting through my windows, casting long shadows across my hardwood floors. It was deep into siesta time, that dead zone when nothing productive ever happens, and my motivation began to wane. I nearly gave up, resigning myself to another evening of Netflix and takeout, when around 5:30 p.m., that yearning came rushing back with renewed intensity. This time, though, it wasn't just the usual desire for nature. I felt drawn toward something more adventurous, perhaps even a little dangerous, something I'd been secretly contemplating for months while watching countless hours of survival videos. Like countless others before me, I'd fallen down the YouTube rabbit hole of stealth camping videos, each one more intriguing than the last. The creators made it look so simple, so achievable. Finding those hidden pockets of wilderness within the urban landscape, setting up camp undetected, and experiencing a taste of true adventure without leaving the city limits. It's fascinating, really. This isn't your grandfather's idea of roughing it in the backcountry or setting up at a designated campsite with numbered plots and nearby restrooms. Stealth camping is urban adventuring at its core, a kind of guerrilla approach to spending a night under the stars, threading the needle between legal and illegal, safe and dangerous. The appeal lies in finding those invisible spaces that exist within the concrete jungle, the forgotten patches of woods behind strip malls, the overgrown lots between industrial buildings, or even, as some bold souls demonstrate, the hidden corners of public parks. The key isn't to go far from civilization. It's to become temporarily invisible within it, to exist in that liminal space between the structured world of society and the wild unknown that still lurks at its edges. The thought had been percolating in my mind for weeks, growing stronger with each video I watched, each forum post I read, until it became an obsession that consumed my idle thoughts. Suddenly, with the evening stretching ahead of me like a blank canvas, it seemed like the perfect time to test my mettle and step into that shadowy world between the civilized and the wild. I set out on my bike toward Forest Park, that sprawling urban wilderness that serves as Portland's green lung, its 5,200 acres of dense forest providing a tantalizing promise of adventure. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows as I pedaled along Highway 30, the traffic whooshing past in a constant stream of metal and exhaust. The wind carried the acrid smell of diesel and the metallic tang of industry, a stark reminder of the urban world I was trying to escape. I rode almost to the magnificent span of the St. John's Bridge, its Gothic arches reaching toward the cloudless sky like the flying buttresses of some great cathedral, before veering west into the woods. The transition from urban to wild was surprisingly abrupt. One moment I was dealing with traffic noise and exhaust fumes. The next I was pushing my bike along an overgrown fire road, where blackberry brambles and stinging nettles formed impenetrable walls on either side. The vegetation was particularly lush after recent rains, creating a tunnel of green that seemed to swallow me whole, the late afternoon light filtering through the canopy in ethereal shafts that danced with floating spores and insects. When the undergrowth became too thick to continue with my bike, I found a young alder tree set back from the path, its smooth bark still bearing the scars of previous visitors' graffiti and rope burns. The late afternoon light filtered through the leaves in a dappled pattern that would have been beautiful under different circumstances, but now seemed to create disorienting shadows that played tricks with my depth perception. After carefully locking my bike to it, triple-checking the lock's mechanism with trembling fingers, I marked the coordinates on my phone's GPS, a precaution that would prove invaluable later. The sound of the lock clicking into place echoed unnaturally loud in the growing stillness of the forest, making me wince. Despite the growing knot of anxiety in my stomach, I've always been the type to overthink everything. I felt surprisingly calm, almost eerily so, as if my body had decided to embrace the adventure while my mind continued to sound warning bells. My preparations had been thorough: lightweight hammock, bug net, water, snacks, and basic first aid supplies all packed efficiently in my backpack. The weight of the pack felt reassuring against my shoulders, like armor against the unknown. Nothing had gone wrong yet, which was almost suspicious given my usually Murphy's Law-prone adventures. The peace I felt in that moment was like a deep exhale after holding my breath all day. But there was something artificial about it, like the strange calm before a storm. Shouldering my pack, I pushed deeper into the park, scrambling up loose soil and dodging low-hanging branches that seemed to reach for me like grasping fingers. The distance wasn't great, maybe a quarter mile as the crow flies, but the terrain made every step a deliberate choice between stable footing and potential disaster. The soil, still damp from recent rains, released an earthy perfume with each step, mixing with the sharp scent of pine needles and the musty odor of decaying vegetation. Gradually, the urban soundtrack of trucks and motorcycles faded, replaced by the evening chorus of birds and the whisper of wind through the Douglas firs. Though it felt remote, I knew this was an illusion, a carefully maintained fiction that my mind was eager to believe. Forest Park may be one of the largest urban forests in America, but it's far from wilderness. The park is bordered by neighborhoods, crisscrossed with trails, and frequented by all manner of visitors, from joggers to nature enthusiasts to those seeking shelter from the city's watchful eyes. Yet as the shadows lengthened and the forest grew quieter, that knowledge provided little comfort. As I picked my way through the undergrowth, I began noticing signs of other human presence that sent chills down my spine. What looked like deer trails at first glance revealed themselves to be well-worn boot paths upon closer inspection, the ground packed hard by countless footsteps. The tracks weren't fresh. The last rain had softened their edges, but they served as a reminder that I wasn't as alone as I might wish to believe. Then came the disturbing discovery: a mound of discarded clothing, perhaps a dozen pairs of shoes in various states of decay, their once bright colors now muted by exposure to the elements. Some were children's shoes, their small size making them seem particularly vulnerable and out of place. The pile had an eerie quality to it, like a modern archaeological site telling some unknown story of loss or desperation. Though my curiosity was piqued, my instincts screamed to keep moving, each heartbeat seeming to whisper, "Danger, danger, danger." Nothing good could come from investigating abandoned belongings in a semi-urban forest at dusk. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, evaluated, judged by unseen eyes. After pushing further uphill, my legs burning from the effort and my shirt sticking to my back with sweat, I finally found what I was looking for: 2 sturdy Douglas firs spaced perfectly for my hammock setup. Their massive trunks rose like ancient pillars into the darkening sky, their bark rough and deeply furrowed, bearing the scars of centuries of survival. Through a break in the canopy, Mount Hood's snow-capped peak glowed pink in the sunset light, like nature's own welcome sign or warning beacon. The spot seemed perfect, far enough from the nearest trail to avoid casual discovery, yet not so remote as to be completely isolated. The golden light filtering through the trees created long shadows that seemed to point toward my chosen spot, like nature's own compass needles. I set about the task of hanging my hammock, which proved more challenging than anticipated in the failing light. My Amsteel utility constructor ropes kept slipping under tension, the synthetic material refusing to grip the way it had in my backyard practice sessions. Every time I thought I had it secure, the knots would slip just enough to make me doubt their stability, forcing me to tie additional knots as preventative measures. The fading light and persistent mosquitoes didn't help matters, their high-pitched whine adding an element of urgency to my fumbling efforts. I found myself envying the knot-tying proficiency of elementary school scouts, remembering how simple it had all seemed in those cheerful YouTube tutorials watched from the safety of my apartment. The ride home was a blur of adrenaline and hypervigilance, every shadow potentially concealing my pursuer, every sound amplified by my fear into potential threats. The warm trickle of blood down my neck served as a constant reminder of how badly things could have gone, each drop a testimony to my brush with tragedy. The familiar streets of Portland seemed alien and threatening now, the city's normal nighttime activities taking on a sinister cast in my heightened state of awareness. When I finally made it back to my apartment, my cat's familiar greeting and the comfortable normalcy of my living room felt surreal after what I just experienced, like stepping from a nightmare into reality. As I cleaned the shallow cuts on my scalp and changed into clean clothes, watching the pink-tinged water swirl down my bathroom drain, I couldn't help but reflect on the irony of seeking solitude, only to find myself in such an intense human encounter. The comfortable weight of my apartment's locks and security system suddenly seemed inadequate protection against the chaos that lurked at the edges of civilization. While I still understand the appeal of stealth camping, I've gained a new appreciation for the safety of designated campgrounds and the wisdom of not camping alone in urban forests. Some risks, it turns out, aren't worth taking just for a night under the stars. Yet sometimes, in the deepest part of night when sleep eludes me, I find myself wondering about that strange man, still out there in the darkness of Forest Park, guarding his mountain of cubic boron nitrate against imagined intruders. And I wonder how many others, seeking adventure or escape, might stumble into his domain, unaware of the dangers that lurk in those shadowy spaces between the wild and the civilized world.